Well, joining me now from London is Lee Jones. He's an Associate Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University. In Strasbourg, we have Julie Girling. She's a member of the European Parliament for South West England and Gibraltar. And Helen Drake. She's a Professor of European Studies at Loughborough University, London. I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Let me start with you, Lee Jones. As we look at what's happening with Brexit, as we reach the end of November 2018, has this government made an entire mess of Brexit?
Well, undoubtedly it has made a real botch job, which is not surprising when you consider that it's basically a Remainer government implementing the decision to leave. The entire British political class is not behind Brexit, is implementing it only reluctantly, and has tried to minimise any disruption to the status quo, and so you end up with essentially Brexit in name only.
Julie Girling, the Europeans are united. They're basically saying it's this or nothing. This is the deal. You take it or leave it. Is that the best way to approach it? And do they have every right to do so?
No, I think if you fail to negotiate for 2.5 years and then suddenly come up with something at the end and say, this is it, take it or leave it, then that's not really an acceptable way to proceed. So I agree with Lee Jones on this one, probably for different reasons, but I think we're in the same place here, that this is unrealistic, unreasonable, and doesn't give really either side what they want. So I can't imagine what the government are thinking about really pushing this agenda. It's crazy.
But I mean, ultimately, I mean, and pardon the sort of crude analogy, but the Europeans are saying, well, you don't get to break up with me, but still want to share the same bed, right? If you want to go, you go, but you don't get to keep all the nice things you had beforehand. And that's where they are right now, isn't it?
Well, that's been the situation. It's not where they are right now. That's been the situation from the beginning. It was very clear that this was going to be extremely difficult. You're leaving 27, and if you feel that you can negotiate and give the 27 something that they really want, and therefore get what you want in return, fine, put it on the table. I don't think that's been done, and we're in the position now where, I mean, some of us, like me, would say, well, we were always going to end up here. I'm just astonished that we didn't end up here 2 years ago. I mean, I could have written this script 24 months ago. And that's the bit where I feel very aggrieved, because it gives absolutely no room for improving this deal at all. It is, as you say, take it or leave it. And neither side of this argument, either me as a strong Remainer or Mr. Jones as a strong leaver, is happy with that.
Okay. Helen Drake, the other two guests are not very happy about where we are. They're both quite depressed about where we are right now. Do you share their pessimism?
Yeah, probably for different reasons again. It was clear right from the outset, and we now have evidence to show that the campaigns themselves around the referendum back in 2016 were flawed for all sorts of different reasons, in particular on the Leave side, but also on the Remain side, in terms of not making a terribly good fist of it, not making a very good or strong case for staying in the European Union. So right from the beginning, right from before the referendum, things were clearly not going to take a sort of a track that we might think of as logical and so on. And then moving forward, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, when she became Prime Minister after that summer of sort of crazy shuffling and so on, she made it very clear. She had red lines that, you know, no customs union, no single market, and so on. And from that moment on, it was always going to be extremely difficult. And then and then Article 50 was triggered. Well, quite early on, although some say it was triggered too soon, some say it was triggered too late. That was a judgment call. Probably, that it was made for internal, in particular, Tory party politics. And so that's why we are where we are now. The clock has been ticking ever since. The EU was negotiated in the way it always was going to negotiate. I don't really know why anyone's surprised about that. The whole sort of, the whole 2.5 years, in a way, has followed a trajectory that I don't really think we should be surprised about. The withdrawal agreement itself, even that, it's not that surprising. Right. It doesn't really please anyone, but nor is it a shoddy document in its own terms.
Lee Jones, why hasn't Theresa May been able to convince her friends that they should support her?
Well, as people have been saying already, it's a deal that satisfies absolutely no one. It's not really a clean break from the European Union, so it doesn't satisfy people who supported who supported leave. But obviously it's not as good as remaining in the European Union, as any deal leaving the European Union would be less than you would get as a member, so that's not surprising either. So it's a deal that really satisfies nobody. It's an attempt to compromise between the two sides and bring the two sides together. And there is some need to try to unite the country, and it is terribly divided. But this deal doesn't do that. It won't convince people because, at the heart of it, large parts of UK territory are essentially going to be remaining within the European Union without any British input into that governance. So it really sacrifices British sovereignty on an ongoing basis. Some people would say it's even worse than the European Union because you can't get out of the backstop without their agreement. Right. At least with Article 50, you could trigger it and walk away.
But certainly, Lee, and I was just recently in Northern Ireland, things like the Troubles might cook up again. This is one of the major worries if there's a hard border, for example, right? And that's one of the reasons why the DUP is having this fascinating relationship with May at the moment. Didn't they think about all this stuff at the beginning? This is the point, right? Of course you knew Northern Ireland was going to be an issue. Suddenly it seems as if, they went, oh, my God, what's going to happen with Northern Ireland? And might there be trouble again if we put a border here? Were they naive and just frankly very stupid a couple years ago when they pushed ahead?
No, not at all. The Irish issue came up during the referendum campaign and didn't sway the argument. And so this was in people's minds from the very beginning. And both sides wanted to avoid a hard border, but I feel like the European Union has used the Irish border issue in order to try to keep the UK aligned as closely as possible to the European Union, in particular to prevent any socialist policies and anything that would allow us to use state aid or anything more competitive. So I feel it's being manipulated. I think there are technological solutions eventually that will allow us to have a frictionless border in the same way that, for example, Switzerland is used. And I think the talk of renewed troubles or violence is really just a shroud waving to try to defeat Brexit. So I think there are pragmatic solutions, but they've been rejected consistently on the EU side, and that's why we end up with this backstop agreement that the UK cannot exit unilaterally without the EU agreeing. So this has been the issue all along, without Britain essentially accepting the responsibility for its sovereignty over Northern Ireland and saying, well, we will manage the border how we see fit. That has allowed the European Union to constantly reject all of the pragmatic ideas that have been put forward by the UK government. And we end up with a really shoddy backstop agreement.
So let's ask Helen. Helen, is that how you see it, that the Europeans have been the spoilers here? They haven't come to the party. It's not the UK's problem. It's not the UK's, I guess, lack of trying.
There is some truth in what the previous speaker just said, but I also would really take issue with, first of all, it may well be true. It's quite a while back now. It may well be true that Ireland and Northern Ireland and the Irish border was mentioned in the campaign, but I can assure you it certainly wasn't at the forefront. Nor even in the background. And one of the things that the withdrawal agreement has respected, if you like, is the sort of the red lines that Theresa May laid down at the front, and in particular the sorts of things that she's been saying most recently in her PR campaign at the moment around freedom of movement. The Prime Minister is sort of setting up some quite unpleasant language around the free movement of Europeans, talking about jumping the queue and so on. And immigration, and in particular immigration from Europe, was much more to the forefront than Ireland. So that I'd just like to say that. Can I say something else?
Yeah, sure. And for the record, just before you continue, for the record, having covered that 2 years ago, one of the central campaign issues was that 75 million Turks were on the verge of entering the UK unless you vote for Brexit. That's something from Istanbul that we remember here. Go ahead, Helen.
In fact, on that, I was asked to go and talk to a group of elderly people living in a home just outside when I was still working on the Midlands campus. I'm on the London campus now. And that was one of the main things that those elderly people told me they were scared about, because, as you know, some on the Leave campaign side had indeed given the impression that, and it's true that Turkey, as you know, was a candidate member, but that's right, they were very worried about that. Going back to the sort of the EU, I think, there's some truth in the fact that on the side of the EU, the Irish border and the question of and that question has been it's been a key issue, but I'm rather reluctant to use the sort of words, I'm sorry, that Lee has, because the European Union has lots of incentives to stay united, and Europe is one of the EU 27. And again, to go back to your question, it was always going to be clear, it was quite clear from the outset that the EU 27 would stick to the integrity of the single market. Whether or not they are, yes, to an extent, that's an exaggerated position, and that's a choice that they're making. But it's not surprising that the EU have made that choice. And I think to sort of ascribe to that choice political intentions to withhold the freedom that Brexit is supposed to bring, I think that's going a bit too far.
Okay, yeah, I mean, for Lee, it's sovereignty. For you, Helen, you don't see it that way. Julie, in the European capitals and within the corridors of power, they'd be following the news and they'd be following the chaos within Parliament over the past few weeks and months. They know it's quite likely that she's not going to get this passed through Parliament. They're saying take it or leave it, and they know that she might not get the support that she needs, or she's most likely not to get the support that she needs. So what are they actually planning for?
Well, that's a really good question, because I agree with your analysis. And of course, Europe, in using that word broadly, has got to think about what it's going to do if that doesn't go through, because the only track at the moment is the cliff edge. So exiting with no deal at all, which is, I agree, not in anyone's interest, and that's the sort of bogeyman that's being held up by the government to try and force British parliamentarians into voting. So I think in, as you call it, the corridors of power here in Brussels, those preparations are well underway. They have been for some months. It's very clear that there will be in place. For example, the Netherlands have taken on over 1,000 new customs people to make sure that their border runs as smoothly as it can do, with its almost hourly shipments on roll off to the UK through Rotterdam. Those preparations continue. Politically, what are they doing? Well, politically, they've been very clear. They've accepted this deal, and all they can do now is hope that London can get it through Westminster. But they've been very clear that they're not going to interfere in that process. Right. Angela Merkel said yesterday, this is now, down to London to do it. Of course, the issue of Ireland, which you've just been discussing, is an interesting one, because I suspect the Irish will not just sit back. It was very clear right from the beginning that the EU 27, and they said clearly, we will take the interests of Ireland top of our list, front of our minds, because they are a member state that are remaining, and I suspect that there will be a great deal of work going on between the 26 plus and Ireland to see that we can open as smoothly as we can.
Lee, for a lot of people, all of this has just, I guess, further justified the need 2 years on, or more than 2 years on, for a new vote. What they call the people's vote. Would you ever support that, Lee?
No, I think it would be absolutely disastrous for British democracy to have a second referendum, the clear intention of which is to overturn a democratic vote a couple of years ago. The issue at hand now is really about consent, the principle of consent in Britain. Can the people instruct their political establishment to do what they want it to do? Or can the political establishment prevaricate, oppose, quarrel, and through sheer incompetence and reluctance, fail to implement those wishes and then bounce back to the people and say, well, we can't really be bothered to implement your instructions, or we can only implement them in a completely botched way. Right. Can you please change your mind and give us a different instruction?
Lee,
that would be terminal for British democracy.
Certainly. At what point have they botched it to such an extent that perhaps the only way is to say, mea culpa, maybe we have to put it to another vote, maybe we gave you the wrong information 2 years ago, maybe we need a fresh start? Isn't that a case for democracy as well, Lee?
The political establishment would be delighted to do that, because for them, this is a complete nightmare. They never wanted the people to give them this instruction, and they're really reluctant to implement it. And so they would love to say, oh, Parliament is paralysed, we can't do what you told us to do, can you please tell us to do something different? And that would be an absolute inflection point for British democracy, where essentially the elite says, you can only tell us to do what we will accept to do. And that would be absolutely disastrous for British democracy. So I don't support the idea of a second referendum, but it's quite possible that a second referendum will be called, precisely because the British political elite on both sides of the aisle really don't want to leave the European Union.
Helen Drake, second referendum?
Well, there's quite a lot to say there, isn't there? Yeah, first of all, then, it would be, so there are lots of problems with the idea of a second referendum. One is, if there were a second referendum, if there were to be, for whatever reason, because parliamentary processes failed, let's say, to be a second referendum, a first point I'd like to say is that it would be extremely important not to couch that in the sort of terms that my colleague just has, in that everybody would have to be very clear that it wasn't in order to get a different outcome. It wouldn't be to reverse leave and have remain. It would be more of a genuine open vote on the basis of what's gone on in the last 2.5 years.
But that was a genuine open vote 2 years ago, right, Helen?
Well, there are issues around the wording of the vote, and there are issues, as I alluded to earlier, about the nature of the campaigns. But the point I'm trying to say is that Lee's right to say that the idea of a second referendum, in order to overturn the result of the first one, would, in today's politics, in British and in particular English politics, be very, very risky. However we want to couch it in a theoretical term. But another thing is that procedurally, there really isn't the time, and I don't think, in order to propose, authorize, organize, hold, and so on a second referendum before the clock. No, but this is important, because that to rush a second referendum would be problematic. I think under those conditions, if somehow a second referendum emerges out of this mess as the path that's going to be taken, then Article 50 would somehow, there'd have to be some sort of extension. And whether the EU would want that or not, I don't know. There's a lot more I could say. So whether or not I personally would like to vote again, that's not the issue. It would be very high risk.
I'm having to ask for extra time here. I want to give Julie the final word here. Julie, we're going to lose your window in less than a minute, so if you could keep your answer very brief, I'd appreciate that. Go ahead, Julie.
First of all, I'd just like to condemn the language that Lee's using, overturn, disastrous. No, it's a perfectly legitimate thing. If a first referendum was a good idea, then a second referendum is just as good an idea. In fact, it's an opportunity to restore people's faith in the democratic process, because if he thinks there is one now that he's preserving by not having a second referendum, he needs to get out more, because all I hear is people are completely fed up with Westminster and its processes. And secondly, just to reply to Helen, the House of Lords report last week suggested that we could have a second vote by the 1st of May. It would require the European Union to extend Article 50 for 2 months. I'm absolutely confident that that can be done. They've said it can be done in order to have a second referendum. Not for the government to faff around more. No, they won't extend. But if it's specifically to have a second referendum, then they will.
Okay, I've got to wrap. Julie, Lee and Helen, listen, it's been a pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers. We will certainly be doing more Brexit coverage before the end of March next year, and we hope to have you all back on the show very soon. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.